The first thing that sort of gets me excited when I go into a Chinese scrapyard is just seeing all this stuff from the U.S. It's like seeing old friends, It's like there's a box of blenders from Chicago. I know that blender manufacturer.
Hey, it's Wilbert L. Cooper, and you're watching the Vice Podcast Show. I'm here with Adam Minter, the author of Junkyard Planet, a great new book that just came out today. Hey, Adam, thanks for coming in.
It's really great.
Yeah, man, when a lot of people talk about, recycling and junk, they tend to think of it as like Sanford and Son or Oscar the Grouch or something, dirty and kind of underground. Can you tell me a little bit, just to lay the groundwork, like how big is this scrap, junk industry, and like what are the global implications of it?
Sure. Well, I should say I love Sanford and Son as much as the next guy, and Sanford and Son is just a small part of what has become a $500 billion global industry.
Okay.
And some are estimating, Bank of America's estimating it could be worth as much as $1 trillion come 2015. That's basically double the economy of Norway.
Wow.
So it's not just Sanford and Son.
Right.
It's essential to everything we do, everything we buy. Everything you own. If it doesn't have something recycled in it, it's somehow touched by recycled content. So it's gigantic.
That's cool. And how did you really get into this, to start thinking about this? Because like you say, a lot of people aren't aware of how big it is. How did you become aware?
Well, my family, dating back to the early 20th century, was in the business. My great-grandfather came over from Russia, wanted to work in vaudeville, and that didn't work out. I guess it usually doesn't. And so he needed a job of some kind, and so he started picking rags off the streets of Galveston, Texas, if you can believe that. Slowly, go from having a burlap sack to having a horse to having a truck to having some land, and he scrapped.
Right.
And so I grew up around this business.
That's
and
cool.
From an early age, I always thought, I want to do a movie about the business, and then I thought, no, actually, I think I'm going to do a book about it. But it was only 3 years ago where I thought I was at a stage where I could actually do it, and thus Junkyard Planet.
That's really cool. And so when you were growing up, you were actually working in the scrapyard with your family? Was it like a family thing?
Oh yeah, it was a family scrap business. It was a little bit Sanford and Son at times, believe me. My grandmother making hot dogs in the back office and serving them to customers, that kind of thing.
And so how does that sort of thing scale up to what we say is like a $500 billion industry? Are there corporations involved? Are there like can you break it down to where we can have something that's small, family operated, and something that is multinational?
Sure. Well, our business was a small scrapyard, but if you go to the developing world, I work in China. I've traveled all over India, all over Asia. The smallest scrap businesses are one guy with the burlap sack. And then it starts scaling up.
Right.
To get where we were with just a small little scrapyard in Minneapolis, you still got that truck, and you've got the horse in between. Where it goes from the small family scrap business to something much bigger, it just requires a little bit of luck, like any business, some capital, and being in the right place at the right time. And a business like that can explode. So you have both large private companies, especially on the coast, and you also have publicly held companies. So most people don't realize this. You can actually trade scrap stock on the So you have companies like Omnisource, which is owned by a company called Steel Dynamics, multi-billion-dollar steel company. They decided to buy a scrap company.
Wow.
And there's others. So you can actually invest in this industry.
That's cool. And so why would somebody want to build things with scrap as opposed to just getting new metal?
Sure. Well, the simple answer is it's cheaper. If you decide you want to make a bunch of ballpoint pen balls, like brass ballpoint pen balls, do you want to go buy the brass down at the local scrapyard, or do you want to go dig a new copper mine out in the Rocky Mountains? Well, that's an extreme example, but the fact of the matter is, if you need raw materials quick, there's no quicker way to get them. It's cheaper and it's faster.
Now, can you tell me about its implications in terms of the environment? Like, is it better for us to, say, go mine for copper, or is it better for us to reuse copper? And what is that?
In my opinion, my feeling is, first of all, that the worst recycling is still better than the best mining.
Gotcha.
I'd still rather see somebody burning a pile of wire, in North Dakota than see somebody digging a copper mine in Tibet.
Right.
Both are going to be environmentally destructive, but that's not the choice. There's cleaner ways of recycling copper, and the great thing about recycling is, you can save 50 to 80% of the energy necessary to produce that same kilo or ton or whatever it will be of the new material. It's always going to be more energy efficient, but it still has its costs. You know, you're still going to have pollution associated with it.
Right.
You know, you're still you're still going to put people at risk. Anytime people are working around heavy equipment, there's still going to be people at risk. So it's not a perfect industry under any circumstance.
One of the things that really struck me about the book, and it's fantastic, is that the nostalgia you have for the scrap and the metal, and it's something, you know, you almost talk about it like someone might talk about going to a baseball game with their dad. It's really cool. Like, was there a moment in your youth when you realized, like, you know what, I really love metal, like that's what I'm into?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. There's sort of two stages that, like, I loved walking through the warehouse, the scrap warehouse with my dad as a kid, and there wasn't one instance of it, but I liked doing that. And you just look at, oh, here's some valves, you know, that doesn't sound interesting. You know, here's some stuff that dripped on the floor of a factory. That was fun. But you know, the other moment, I was just talking to my wife about this. I'd never told her the story, and I told it to her last night. My grandmother and I used to go garage sailing. You know, we loved garage sailing.
Really?
You know, and that's scrapping of a different kind.
Right.
You're going out and looking at, you know, value at what other people don't want. We were at a garage sale once in Minneapolis, and the guy was trying to sell her a clock, and he said it's white brass.
Okay.
Well, there's no such thing as white brass. But he's looking at this little old lady saying, you know, I'm gonna cheat her out of this. Well, my grandmother grew up in the business. Her dad was an immigrant. So she pulled out the magnet she kept in her purse and tossed it at the clock, and it immediately stuck to the clock, and she said, that's steel. You know, and I said, you know, that's my grandma, and I'm going to do something with this industry.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And so the scrap industry seems to have changed a lot. I know that the prices have gotten higher. Yeah. What are some of the reasons why prices have increased, and is that part of the reason why it's more of a lucrative, bigger business now?
Definitely. I mean, there's really one word that explains the rising prices, and that's China.
Gotcha.
China is everything. You know, as the developing world rises, but especially China, they want to buy the same stuff that we have here in the United States. There's middle class consumers, but they also want to supply stuff to us. Well, all of that requires raw materials. So we've been talking about copper, so I'll continue with copper.
Yeah.
But you know, right up until about 1990, copper was about $1 a pound, and it stayed that way for decades. Go up a couple cents one year, down a couple cents another year. You know, and that was just demand from the U.S. and Europe. All of a sudden, in the late 80s, China comes on the market and it starts ticking up, up, up. And by 2007, it was up to $4 a pound. Nothing like that had ever happened. There was only one reason. It was China. And that made a lot of people very, very wealthy. And you can do that with paper, you can do that with steel, you can do that with plastic. Name the raw material. China needs it because it's got a growing middle class and it's got a growing manufacturing base to export to us.
That's one of the things I caught in the book too, is it kind of talked about, like, they don't have some of those resources in China. Is that true? Like, what resources are they really looking for because they don't have them there?
Well, they're very strategic. I mean, you know, they don't have access to a lot of steel. They don't have much iron ore, so they really want to start upping their the steel that they bring in. But also metals like copper, aluminum, you know, also paper, because they have limited forest resources. Plastic requires a lot of oil, and you know, they're now the #1 car-consuming country in the world, so they'd much prefer to see that oil going into the gas tanks than into the plastics factories.
Right.
So, but they're also very strategic. Even though they have this stuff, they're saying, let's hold on to our resources here and let's import their junk and use that.
Right.
You know, when we really need our stuff, it'll be there. But in the meantime, this is going to be a better, more efficient, and profitable way for us to do it. And at the same time, we're probably going to save, you know, the environment a little bit in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So they're very, very savvy about it.
You mentioned cars a little bit. I know in the book it kind of breaks down the different ways that people might have looked at cars from back in the day in terms of scrapping or junking, and then today. Can you kind of walk me through that? Like, how would someone look at a car when they bring it into the yard back when you were a kid as opposed to today?
Sure. Well, you know, a car would come in and you would just look at a couple pieces on it, you know, as being worth any kind of money. You'd want to pull off the radiator, you know, because that's aluminum and copper, so that's got money. You know, you want the catalytic converter because that's got platinum in it.
Right.
You know, those could be worth, you know, $300, believe it or not. Most people don't realize that. You know, you maybe look at the hubcaps, and then you take the thing and you just crush it. You know, and send it off for it to be shredded.
Okay.
You know, these days there's going to be much more pulled off a car because the raw material prices have gone up. You know, people are going to actually take the trouble to pull some of the wiring out. by hand because the copper's worth so much money. They'll look at some of the plastics. Like, most people don't realize that the taillight plastic, that's very expensive and it's a very high-grade plastic, and there's a big market both in China and the United States for that kind of material. So, people start taking things apart more because they have higher value.
Is there are there new machinery and new technology that has built up just to sort of support this growing industry?
Sure. I mean, the big transformation of the industry in terms of machinery started in the 1960s. Before the 1960s, to recycle a car was difficult.
Right.
I mean, you have to take it apart by hand. You hear accounts of people taking it apart by pickaxes, or they had in the late 1950s, you had these automobile crematoriums where you'd actually drive a car underground and set it on fire so you could burn off all the seats, the tires and everything, and then you're left with the metal, and you can pull it out real easy. Well, in the 60s, some very smart scrappers down in Texas started developing shredders, giant shredders that could reduce a car, to the size of your fist, and then you shred it, and then you can sort it out using magnets and blowing air on it, so the really light stuff like the seats that have been shredded, you just blow it right off. It was an incredible invention.
Right.
Then the next stage came in the 1970s where they actually developed technologies where you could separate the plastics from the metal, the different metals, and that all exists right now. But the ironic thing is, as great as that technology is, it's still more profitable to sort it by hand by exporting it to developing nations.
Wow. And also the shipping industry, right? Like, has the shipping industry changed at all with the junk industry? Like, because we're doing so much overseas, like how do those two things kind of grow? How do those two things grow together?
Yeah, they're very closely related. The way I tell people to think about it is, China ships a lot of stuff to the United States, and the United States really doesn't have much to ship back to China.
Okay.
So there's a lot of competition in China for shipping containers. We all know what these look like, these 40-foot long boxes. So to ship a container from Shenzhen, China, that's the manufacturing heartland of China, to Los Angeles, costs right now about $2,400. Now, you got all those containers, once they're emptied, sitting in Los Angeles or Long Beach. The shipping company's like, we got to get these back so we can ship more stuff back to the U.S. So what they do is they discount them. So right now, it costs about $300 to ship from Los Angeles to Shenzhen. Well, that's a great subsidy if you've got scrap metal that you want to send back to China. But the more interesting thing is it's very expensive to ship in the United States. So to ship that same container from Los Angeles to Chicago or to Cleveland runs about $2,500. Okay.
Gotcha.
So it's actually cheaper to send it to China. So that's the incentive to send all the stuff, especially from the west coast of the United States, to Asia to be recycled, not keep it here.
So when you were a kid and you love scrap metal, what made you want to leave the yard? Are you still in the yard? Like, what are you doing on a day-to-day? I know you're a writer and you're writing for the Atlantic and stuff like that. But
it was a family business, and like all family businesses, there's conflicts in family businesses. Right. Who's going to be the boss? And I learned, started learning in my early 20s. I'm really not a businessman. I'm meant to do other things, you know, and most of my family members would tell you the same thing. So I actually ended up deciding to go into journalism, and I ended up going to China on some freelance assignments, working for trade magazines, and so I don't have actually anything to do with the family business anymore. And the family business actually, the original location of it was sold to the city of Minneapolis, so now it's just a small warehouse. It's a small business, not what it was when I grew up in it.
What was so interesting too is, reading some of your stuff, when you talk about walking through the scrapyards and the scrap facilities in other countries, you get excited too. Can you tell me how an operation in China is similar or different to what's going on in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, they're very different.
Okay.
And the first thing that sort of gets me excited when I go into a Chinese scrapyard is just seeing all this stuff from the U.S. It's like seeing old friends, It's like, there's a box of blenders from Chicago. I know that blender manufacturer, But there's so little in common. In the U.S., the industry and the labor means that machines are usually used for recycling.
Right.
China, it's hands. And so you walk into these warehouses, sometimes that are just massive warehouses. You'll have 200-300, usually women, working on sorting metals, braking motors. I mean, it's just epic. You can't, 3D film wouldn't do justice to what these are.
And how many people would you say are working in like an average one?
Well, those are very big ones. But I've seen smaller ones. You can find a lot of family workshops too. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I like to do when I'm traveling in small town China, I can always find the local scrapyard. And it's like it's somebody's house, it's something on the main street, and it's just packed with stuff. And that can be, dad, mom, and 2 kids. Who are doing the business, and they're probably, you look at their house and you see out front, they got all this scrap, and you're thinking, oh man, these people are poor off, but probably they're the best people off in town. They're the richest folks in town. It's every one of these is different. It's so hard to say that they're like this or like that.
Right.
I mean, the only difference with the U.S. and China you can really generalize is like a lot of machinery in the U.S., very little in China, and the scale of the Chinese facilities when you get into the really big ones is just. It's monumental.
There are some similarities you draw in the book to how the modern day scrapyards are in China and how they were in the U.S. back in the day in terms of environmental regulations and stuff like that. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, we tend to, in the United States, think of ourselves as quite environmentally advanced.
Right.
And we tend to forget, some of our origins. So, one of the things that people complained about when they started reporting on Chinese scrapyards in the 90s, especially, was all the burning wire. You'd drive into these towns and you'd see these black clouds of smoke over the town. And what it was people setting fire to giant piles of wire to get the insulation off so you had the copper. This is nothing we didn't do in the United States. My relatives, my family did this kind of thing as well. I'm not embarrassed to say it. It was perfectly acceptable.
Yeah.
You didn't think of it in those terms, and we grew out of it in the 70s. We stopped doing it. There's still people who burn wire a little bit in the U.S., but not as much as there was. Well, China's starting to grow out of it as well. But the industry came from those same kinds of origins, and there's all kinds of, unfriendly environmental practices like that which took place.
Is it kind of a game where the places that kind of stuff happens just moves to a different place? So like will we see, the burning of and the negative environmental things happening in like Sudan or some other place where the regulations are much lower and people are more willing to go through that to make money.
Right. That's a great question. Well, China has tried shutting down some of these towns where you have really bad experiences. So I write about one in the book called Wenan, which is a plastics recycling zone in northern China. It's a county, huge county, about 450 square miles. Probably the worst environmental disaster I'd ever seen. The government a couple years ago said, that's it, we're shutting it down. What happened then? They just scattered to all other parts of northern China. So it actually made the situation much worse. The best thing would have been let it be and encourage the industry and subsidize the upgrade. Instead, they've spread it all over the place. In terms of the scrap industry moving to Africa and other countries, I get people asking me about Africa quite a bit.
Yeah.
And for now, it won't. And that is because Africa doesn't manufacture that much.
That's the other side of it.
Yeah, because the only reason you recycle something is so you can make it into something new. Well, right now, Africa isn't making that much stuff. China's still the king, But over time, as Africa starts to go through this renaissance that it seems to be starting right now, I think you will see some things flowing in there, and I think you will see that happen. But this idea that everything will leave China, so long as China is the world's biggest manufacturer or second biggest manufacturer, it's going to be the world's biggest recycler. Those two things go very closely together.
Right. As from an American standpoint, what does that say about our preeminence in terms of global economics? Does it say should we care that there's a lot of this stuff is going to China? What should we look at it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a new story, actually.
Right.
I mean, the U.S. Right now exports about 40% of all the recyclable materials that it generates, and that's a lot. But 60% of it stays here,
right.
And feeds factories here. But the U.S. has been exporting scrap to other countries since the early 20th century.
Right.
It's always been a global business where there's demand for raw materials that'll go. But I think your point is a good one because I mentioned this in the book. In the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, the U.S. started importing steel from the U.K. and then started importing rags from the U.K. And of course, the U.K. at that point was right at the peak of its power.
Right.
It was rich and it was throwing away a lot of stuff. And as in the U.S., which was on the rise at that point, saying, bring it on over here.
Yeah.
And I think that's something, to think about, And one of the, I say about recycling, it's a story about recycling, but it's also a story about manufacturing.
Right.
And right now, the U.S. doesn't have enough manufacturing to handle all that stuff, so it's got to go somewhere else.
Well, one of the things that was so cool about your book was you talk a lot about the iPhone.
Yeah.
And can you, kind of break it down for me? just even some more, like, what are the steps that, how does the iPhone relate to the scrap industry, and like, what are the steps that it takes to get one of these?
Right, right. Well, the thing with the iPhone and the thing with all smartphones is they're very complex products. So it means that the more complex a product is, the more difficult it is to recycle, period. There's more parts to take apart. And one of the things about the iPhone that I find very intriguing is that Apple very much promotes itself as a company that's green.
Right.
And they've been advertising since the 5S and the 5C came out, send your phone to us for recycling.
For sure.
And I go into that a little bit in the book. What does that mean? How does Apple recycle its phones? Well, the way Apple recycles the phones, if they're not going to sell them for reuse, is they shred them. Okay? So literally, they put them in a shredder, and you break it down into tiny, tiny pieces, and then they'll use some technologies to sort it out. But a lot of that phone, once it's shredded, is not reusable, obviously, and it can't be recycled. I've got one too here.
Yeah.
Where's mine? I've got a 4S that looks like a 5.
Yeah.
I mean, the glass can't be recycled. Once you've shredded this thing, some of these circuits in the battery, which could be perfectly reusable, can't be reused anymore. Some of these plastics, there's simply nowhere in the United States to recycle them. Okay. Meanwhile, Apple makes it very hard to upgrade the phone. You can't switch out your battery in an iPhone. So, you have to pay them $80, $90 to do it. So that's a disincentive for people to keep their phone. It's an incentive to send it to Apple to let them shred it.
Right.
So I argue in the book that this is kind of not a very green product, despite the fact that it's depicted as such.
So what are the more ethical or better ways to have like these kind of commercial products? Is it something that you can switch things out and you can upgrade easily without having to send it back?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really cool movement now I'm really into called DFR, Design for Recycling.
Okay.
And Design for Recycling is also Design for Reuse,
Right.
Let's make products that, you don't have to throw away, that they're easy to upgrade. Maybe they're modular, you can pop a new module in. We're all gonna upgrade. I mean,
Right.
I've got a 4S here, I'm planning on getting a 5,
For sure.
I want it,
Yeah, definitely.
But is there a more environmentally friendly way to do this? We're all going to consume, but is there a way we could do this so that the products last longer, that we're not putting much stress on raw materials? The other way to do that, of course, is to recycle these in a different way. So if you send these products oftentimes to China in particular, if people don't want it, like a first-generation iPhone, nobody wants a first-generation iPhone anymore. Yeah, not even in India where they reuse a lot of products. So they'll take apart that first-generation iPhone, and they will pull out the reusable bits, and they'll take out like the chips, and they'll sell them in the chip markets, and those chips will find their way into toys or into scrolling signs and all this stuff. Well, the big electronics manufacturers hate that.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Why do they hate it?
Well, because it's taken away their business. It's a competition for them. Apple's not competing against the guy who takes a Motorola chip and runs a sign that says what the daily specials are, blue plate specials are. But they still don't want to see their products in an aftermarket. It's competition. Samsung, which makes chips, they really hate it. They don't, and a lot of people counterfeit these things. So they'll pull them out and they'll say they're new, and sell them. But on the other hand, if you stop and think about it, it's, they're counterfeiting, but it is counterfeiting that's kind of good for the environment.
Definitely.
These are the hard choices. This is where it's all a very gray area.
Right.
It's not really black and white or, green and white, if you will. You know what I mean? And that's how we tend to think of things in the U.S. We want it to be very yes or no, but the truth is, most of the truth lies in the middle area there, and these are very hard choices that we all have to make as consumers.
What are some of the other issues that you've seen that sort of exist in that gray area in scrapping? Are there any other things that kind of make you realize, well, I walked into it thinking this thing, but then I look at it and I see something a little bit different, or something that makes me question my initial ideas?
I had a moment in India about 7 years ago that really changed me. And I went through a market in Mumbai. It was a scrap market. It's an amazing place. And you walk through and people are recycling all kinds of different things there. And I came across people with these giant plastic bags which looked like trash was in it. Didn't look like scrap, like I said, really looked like trash. And I got closer, and what it was Blister Packs. Do you know what a blister pack is?
No, what's a blister pack?
A blister pack is when you get like you buy like some Tylenol, and it comes in a pack that you pop out.
Okay.
So you have the plastic caps, and then it pops through the foil. Okay. And these were giant bags of blister packs, and what people were doing was peeling the foil off the back of that plastic. And that for me was this really transformative moment because I suddenly realized we're not really thinking very hard about how to build these things to be recycled. That's a horrible product from an environmental sustainability side. I don't care what those medicines were for. Surely there's a better, more environmentally sound way to package that stuff. Now, in India, the labor's so cheap and conditions can be so bad that people will actually they'll employ themselves by peeling that foil off.
Yeah.
But that for me, I don't know if that's a gray area, but it was very much a transformative moment where I really started thinking that the manufacturers have to start taking more responsibility for the design of their products from a green standpoint. And it's not just using green components. Like Apple likes to brag about how they don't have toxins in a lot of their products. That's fine. But to me, the higher level issue is, how do you make this so it can be disposed of easier, upgraded easier, recycled easy? That to me it is a bit of a gray area because it's hard, but it's the pressing issue.
Is it like what responsibility do you think consumers have when they're buying products to think about this stuff? Like, should we, as people who are out there shopping for Christmas stuff, like how prescient do we need to have these in our minds to change the behavior of other people who are making stuff?
Yeah, I mean, somebody just said this to me the other day: buy cheap, buy twice. Okay. Which is true. You buy something cheap and it breaks quickly, and then you're going to go buy again. I think that as consumers, look, I'm an American. I'm a consumer.
For sure. Me too.
You can't tell people, reduce your consumption. Yeah. That's it. But you can tell people to buy better. Buy things that are going to last, Buy things that aren't immediately disposable. There's lots of areas where we can't. We all buy bottled water. We're going to continue buying bottled water. But, buying higher quality products is really great. Somebody gave me an example of this just the other day, is the power strip, surge suppressor. Okay. There's two kinds of surge suppressors. One that has a fuse in it that when the surge comes through, it just blows out, surge suppressor dead. And one which has a switch that just lifts up, and you can reset the surge suppressor. Oh. Okay? The one that has the switch, you can reset it. It's more expensive. But that's the kind of example we're talking about. And I think as consumers, those are the things we can ask manufacturers to do. I mean, I don't want to come off as a total Apple critic, but I can't switch out the battery in this thing, and I can't add memory to it. If I could, I might keep it longer.
Definitely.
I mean, if I can add memory to this, I maybe can put in, iOS 8, iOS 9. But right now with a 4S, 7's running slow. Mm-hmm. These are the sorts of things that I think we can start asking for as consumers. I'm an American. I know we can't ask too much from people, but you can ask those simple steps, and then let's see where it goes.
Definitely. One of the things that was interesting to me kind of was just thinking about how important metal is to the world. And it was a little bit like I guess, I don't know, it's kind of silly. I was like, oh, we still need metal that much? I don't know why, but you feel like you're living in the future. You hear stories about guys, I don't know if you heard about the story we run on Vice.com about a guy who survives on Soylent. It's like a new fluid he's created that he drinks, and it provides him sustenance. He doesn't have to eat food. And just weird things that people are doing to kind of get beyond the confines of the past. Right. And metal has been something that we've used forever, you know? And so it's so interesting to me to think that we're still very, very connected to all different kinds of precious metal.
Absolutely. I mean, we keep talking about the iPhone, but, there's a lot of metal in here, and a lot of precious metal that's becoming more and more expensive because we need more and more of it. The palladium, the platinum, these are very rare elements. I'm sure you might have heard the phrase rare earth metal.
No.
That's a very important. China has something like 90% of the world's rare earth metal reserves. And they go into things, just a few grains may go into the screen, but that makes it capable of doing the touch screen. All of these things exist, and they're very, very difficult to recycle. So, it comes back to the recycling issue. If we can't recycle this stuff, we're going to price ourselves out of being able to use some of this stuff. Yeah, we're absolutely dependent upon it.
Where do you think a lot of the scrap industry and the junkyard industry is going? What are some of the new movements or new things that are really exciting to you that see us taking it into the future?
I think it's what I was talking about really is this idea of designing for recycling. And you're starting to see it a little bit in China where you have actual OEMs and ODMs. These are the companies like Foxconn that actually make stuff. They want to start recycling the stuff too. So they want to start taking it back. Because one, they see it as a business opportunity, but two, raw materials are getting more expensive. I'm sure Apple would love to get this back and be able to take some of these parts, and so then they don't have to go on the open market and buy whatever it is, the glass, whatever, to make a new iPhone. So that's at the very early stages of happening. There's a company called Wistron, which is based in Taiwan, where they've set up plastic recycling in their plant in Kunshan, which is north of Shanghai. Now they manufacture for BlackBerry, Lenovo, and forgetting it's Acer. And they're now taking back the plastics from computer monitors, which they're recycling and turning into plastics for new electronics.
Right.
That to me is very cool. And
really
I think it's the future. We'll see if it works as a business. We don't know yet. It might not, but they're the real pioneers in this, so it'll be interesting to see how it goes.
I think a lot of times we think about the relationship between, the junk and scrap and China. What are some of the other scrap yards around the world like? Is it very different in say the UK, or what is it like in Mexico? Like, do you have any familiarity with some of those other places?
I mean, I'm most familiar with the U.S. And China, but I've traveled throughout Asia, and the funny thing about this business is it's pretty much the same everywhere. It just becomes scale.
Right.
There's a way to do it. And if you can afford a little bit of equipment, you get that, and then you do it like the other guys who have a little bit of equipment. But there's not that much difference. The only difference is the talent and the people who run the businesses. There's people who have a talent for seeing value where other people don't, and they're the ones who tend to be the most successful. But it doesn't change that much. The environmental conditions in certain places will be different. India, in my experience, is probably the worst environmental conditions I've seen. But
really?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So what are some of these? We talked about the burning, but what are some of the other environmental questions or conditions that we have?
Sure. Well, I mean, plastics recycling can be a really ugly thing because to recycle plastics, there's ways of doing it. But if you use sort of the small-scale, family-style workshop, you'll shred the plastics into small pieces. Then you need to wash them. Okay, and you'll use a caustic cleaning agent. Those caustic cleaning agents in small towns, there's nowhere to dispose of that stuff properly. So what do you do with it? You toss it in the creek, you toss it on the ground. So that's a terrible consequence. Then when you actually start the process of melting the plastics into new plastics, it emits fumes. If you're in a small enclosed workspace, you're breathing those fumes. Those fumes can literally plasticize your lungs over time.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's pretty awful. Sorting operations, you see in the book, we have pictures of, people doing this hand sorting.
Yeah.
Some places they'll give them face masks to protect from the dust, which is all you really need. Some places they won't. These are, it sounds like a small thing, but inhaling dust can be extremely destructive to your lungs over time. So there's all kinds of issues. In the paper recycling industry, China's paper recycling industry was notoriously dirty and was responsible in large part for killing off much of the Yellow River, which I'm sure you've heard of in the 1990s. It's come back a little bit. They've done a pretty good job of shutting down or at least regulating some of these plants. So it can be bad. And we had those kinds of problems in the U.S. too. I mean, it's fair to mention that. There's not much they did there we didn't do first. But we improved, and steadily, at least in China, they're improving. I don't see as much improvement in India.
One of the things it was actually in the introduction that I found was really interesting, and I guess it's kind of hard to even see the scope of this, is you talk about how it's hard to get clean data on the junkyard industry and the scrap industry. What are the challenges for someone who's so interested in this, and it's such a big industry, to figure out how big it is? Like, we might probably be underestimating even how the scope of it, right?
Definitely. In fact, there's a real incentive for a lot of companies to downplay how much they're bringing in. I talk about this later in the book, the import-export trade. People cheat on the numbers that on what they're exporting, the weights. They will tell different stories for all kinds of different reasons, usually tax savings. So because of all this tax cheating on the import-export trade, you have no idea what's being shipped. I've had the experience of being at conferences with Chinese government officials, and officials from different agencies will get up and give different numbers on what the weights and volumes are for a specific commodity being shipped into China. So it's a big challenge, and sometimes all you can do is talk about parameters.
So can you tell me a little bit about the process of Christmas lights going overseas? That was really fascinating in the book.
Sure. Well, the whole Christmas tree lights story for me started just visiting a scrapyard in China. I saw a pile of Christmas tree lights that probably weighed a ton sitting in this recycling yard, and it became a quest of mine to figure out what on earth are people doing with this stuff. So I went around the United States trying to find people who exported it. Found a guy who said, "I'll hook you up." in this town called Shijiao with my buddy who owned the scrapyard there. It's like, great. So, I went down to Shijiao, and Raymond Lee is his name, and he took me to his plant where they recycle about 2 million pounds of American Christmas tree lights per year. And they're just one factory out of, he told me, 10 in that town that do a similar volume. So that's 20 million pounds of American Christmas tree lights hitting this one small town in China every year. Shame on Americans for tossing out. I mean, come on, people. But we all know these Christmas tree lights are really cheap and they're manufactured in China. But anyway, so how do they do it? How do you recycle a Christmas tree light? Well, the issue is, what is a Christmas tree light? It's glass, it's insulation, and it's copper. So the way you do it is you first put it in a shredder, chop it up into this mulch, pour water on it so it's this goop of metal, rubber, and glass. And then you put it on a giant table that basically shakes with water going across it. Now, if you looked at that table, you go, what on earth's going on here? Yeah, so this is how I explain it. Think of a stream bed with a really fast current going on it, and it's got stones on the stream bed, okay? The pebbles are going to flow really fast with the current, and the boulders are going to stay in one place. Well, the insulation and glass weigh very little. But the copper weighs a lot. So the water just washes away basically the insulation and the glass, and the copper stays in place, and it divides out really nicely.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's not so easy. I mean, at Raymond's factory, he told me it took about a year to get it tuned up, so it just worked right. And Christmas tree lights, I guess, standard across the industry are 28% copper. I don't know. But it's like, so they tuned it so it could do that. It was amazing.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to the question I had asked you earlier, but it's so fascinating to me to think about all the new industries that are built up around trying to figure out ways to extract copper, extract steel from these different items. Is there like a leading company that's doing that, or are there like some people you can point to that are like, those guys are really thinking innovatively? Because I mean, in a lot of ways, that's like a service to all of us, right?
Yeah, I mean, there is innovation in the industry. I mean, there's one company, and I write about them towards the end of the book, called Huron Valley Steel. It's an amazing company in Michigan that nobody has ever heard of. They're very private. They like a low profile, very nice people, but they've actually developed technologies that can take a mixture of metals and, I mean, separate out the whole thing as clean as possible. And I tell the story in the book of being in their plant. Their specialty is actually sorting out shredded American automobiles into its various components. And I went through one of their plants. I was walking through it one day, and I saw, as we went through it, literally coins falling off a conveyor, being shot out of a conveyor.
Wow.
And you look into this box the size of this table, and it's just filled with American coins. I said, what's going on here? And they said, well, when people drop off their cars at the junkyard, they got change in the seats, and that stuff's got to be recovered. They told me the average American car is shredded, recycled with $1.65 and change in it. So they devised a way mechanically to get that change out, and then they sell it back to the U.S. Treasury. They're literally making money. It's the most amazing thing you've seen, and I can't tell you how they do it. I had to agree not to.
There's like a secret.
Yeah, there's a trade secret there. But I can tell you, I saw it literally raining money out of this off these conveyors. It's absolutely incredible. So they're a technology leader for sure. There's other companies that have developed really interesting ways of doing things, but they're not big names. It's more of a steady evolution right now.
Right. I was really interested, we've talked a little bit about this idea of people handpicking through scrap in other countries. Was there ever a time when people were doing that here?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, forget the scrap. I mean, we had people doing what you see, these, like in Slumdog Millionaire, you have people picking through trash at dumps looking for recyclables. We had people doing that here. And one of the guys I write about in the book, Leonard Fritz, who founded Huron Valley Steel Company, he started out doing that, 8, 9 years old.
Right. So is that like what you were talking about in the book with like grubbing?
That's grubbing. So he referred to it as a term I'd never heard before.
Right. I saw it, I was like, oh,
Leonard.
That's dope.
Yeah. It's a great cool term, isn't it? It's cool. So, so he said, we went grubbing. When he first said it to me, I was like, what?
Right.
And then I was like, I got it. Okay.
Yep.
So, these kids in India are grubbing in the dumps. It's hard work. Leonard told the story. I mean, he's out there grubbing in the Detroit municipal dumps in the 1920s with hobos who couldn't care if he's 9 or 90. That's something that's real. And we did that.
Yeah. Are there any other like cool terms or any like colloquial things that are sort of inside the scrap industry that people don't know? Could you break me off some cool scrap lingo?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole thing, there is this sort of secret language of scrap. It's called the ISRI specs. So all of the different commodities. Like for you, you'd look at a pile of radiators and, and say radiators. You look at a pile of shredded scrap and say maybe garbage or whatever. If you're in the industry, you call that shredded scrap Zorba. And if it's got circuit boards in it, you call it Zurich.
Gotcha.
There's you look at a bunch of brass scrap, like plumbing scrap, that's honey.
Really,
and these,
honey?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and these terms, then there's literally hundreds of these terms. Oh, they're just crazy. You can download them from the website for the trade organization, and they've been in use since the 20s. They did it because the reason they wanted these, I'd always wondered, and then finally looked in and they said, well, the reason they developed these was in the old days of the scrap business, you were still trading between cities, and you needed to tell people what you're sending them or what you wanted to buy, and you tell them via telegram. So you wanted as short a manner as possible.
Right.
So you just come up with these, 5 and 6 letter terms, like honey, to cover it. It's really funny stuff.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
I loved, like, towards the end of the book, you talk about Johnson Zang and his role. I think it was really fascinating to me. Can you break it down just for our Vice readers?
Sure.
What his role is and what people like him do.
Yeah, so Johnson Zang is a traveling scrap buyer, and he's about one of 100 on the road at any given time in the U.S., and he's on the road right now, actually, because I had an email from him last night. And what he does is he goes around to scrapyards all over the United States and literally buys their scrap and then exports it back to China. And this is not some small-scale traveling salesman. Right. I traveled with him for a week, and when he picked me up in St. Louis, we're just chatting in the car, and I said, Johnson, so what are you looking to spend this week? And he said, about $1 million in scrap metal that was sent back to China.
Shopping spree, huh?
Yeah, exactly. And he was disappointed because he couldn't pull it off. Because you got to cut a deal, and he couldn't cut every deal he wanted. But that's big money. He plays a critical role, in guys like him, in getting the stuff from the United States to China, and it's the stuff that his Chinese buyers want. They trust him. He speaks English. He's a Chinese guy. He's a very interesting story in his own right. So they trust him. He's their eyes and ears, and he'll go in, and if he doesn't know what it is, takes out his BlackBerry, snaps a photo of it, and within 5 minutes he's got a note back from some guy in rural Guangdong province saying $2.25 a pound, and he then arranges the shipping back.
Very cool. And so when you own a company and you want to manufacture something, right? Like say you're a Chinese company and you want to manufacture something, do you call up that guy Zang and how does it go from being sent to China and then being turned back into something usable and quality?
Sure. Well, the people who are buying from him are scrap recyclers. So they're the ones who are going to do one of two things. They're going to actually, the stuff that Johnson sends back is stuff like copper wire or Christmas tree lights he'll send back. I was with him. I saw him buy Christmas tree lights,
Crazy.
And they're the ones who will recycle that into the insulation and the copper. And then they'll sell it to the manufacturer, So those are the guys he's selling to. So the manufacturers then call the scrap companies and say, we need 2 ton of X, please send it over. Sometimes those scrap companies are small family-owned operations. Sometimes they are very, very big. The company in the town where Johnson sends a lot of his stuff, Qingyuan Jintian, turns over hundreds of millions of dollars a year. They're a scrap copper buyer, and they'll sell it then to the factories. They actually melt it down themselves and then sell the bricks, the ingot, copper ingot to the factory. So but it's a very sensitive business. These guys in China who place orders with Johnson, they're having lunch, and a big part of their daily job is just having lunch and dinner, finding out what people need, where the economy is going, so they can make give Johnson good instruction. Because it's a dangerous thing Johnson does, because they pay cash for it, and then it takes 6 weeks, 5-6 weeks to get from China or from the United States to China. Well, the price of copper in that time can tank. You could lose a lot of money as well.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So you dedicated this book to your grandmother. Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about her? Because I was so interested in some of the anecdotes and things you had about her. Yeah.
Well, my grandmother, Betty Zeman, I say she scrapped, and she did. And she grew up in the business, daughter of an immigrant scrap dealer, and we were very close. I was all but raised by her, and I used to work beside her, in the scrap yard, and she taught me how to buy, a lot of scrap sitting at the scale there and what to look out for. We would sit at the cameras and watch the employees, and we always got a kick when the employees would try and sneak something off into the corner that came in. She'd say, "See, watch them," and then she'd send me out there to go retrieve it.
Right,
and I'd watch the employees giving me the look of death as I take their great prize.
Right.
And then we would garage sale as well. It was the same kind of concept. It was a very special relationship. She meant the world to me.
That's really, really cool. And it seems like, are there a lot of women in the scrap and in the junkyard game?
Yes and no. I mean, the old style American scrapyards, the Jewish American scrapyards, because there's about 90% Jewish at one point.
Really?
Oh yeah, very much so. European Jews, they couldn't get other jobs,
Gotcha.
So you would always have, it'd always be the guy who's the front,
Yeah.
But you always had the grandmother or the wife, basically running the office behind, and that's a key role. That's just as important as the front office job, But it still remained a very male-centric business, and it is still in the United States. It's a trading business. I mean, if you go to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange or the Commodities Exchange, it's going to be mostly men out there trading. For whatever reason, it attracts men. In China, interestingly, you see more and more women as traders and more women at a managerial level. And you definitely see more women working in the scrapyard doing the metal sorting. It's politically incorrect, but I've always asked guys, why are you only hiring women to sort the metal? And their response is universally the same. Women are more precise. And a lot of women I know would agree with that assessment, and so that's why they hire them to do that kind of work. That's the explanation given to me, and whether that's true or not, it's very much the rationalization they use.
That's really, really cool. And you're married?
Yes.
You have any kids?
No kids yet.
Okay.
No kids yet.
Do you take your wife with you in the scrapyards and stuff?
Yeah.
She get a kick out of it as well?
Yeah. We were dating. I took her to a metal shredder, and she loved it,
That's cool. The perfect girl for you.
Perfect girl. It's like, if you could like this, we're going to work out just fine, But yeah, she likes traveling with me, and we were actually married during a scrap convention.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, in Las Vegas.
So you're really serious about the scrap game.
Yeah, there was a lot of reasons for that, but it worked out great. I said, we can do it during this convention, and she said, all right, let's do it.
That's excellent. Well, this book is incredible. I love a lot of the personal anecdotes and all of the things you have to say from your personal perspective. Being a part of a family that was part of the scrap industry, but it's also, I think it's a really important read for the global perspective that you provide. And so thank you so much for just laying down some really important knowledge I think everybody can get a lot from. And hopefully people can take some stuff away from this to, learn about recycling and making this world a little bit better.
Well, thank you very much.
I appreciate it.